Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is James Smith. I co-chair the CCUS Council together with the Energy Minister. Welcome to our session this morning on CCUS through an economic lens. In my opinion, this is a hugely important subject because it represents an enormous opportunity for the UK. Some of you may have a sense of the numbers. The capital investment for CCUS in the UK is likely to be of the order of £100 billion between now and 2050, with a similar amount for operating costs. And against that background, two goals are crucially important. The first goal is that the CCUS low carbon investment projects are on time, on budget, and technically successful so that they deliver the mitigation that's desperately needed. And of course, no one takes that for granted. But we have great people in great teams, in great companies and consortia who've been working on this for a long time and are raring to go and looking forward to announcements in a couple of weeks' time. The second goal is that our nation can modernize, grow and reinvigorate its industrial base, putting the UK and regions in the UK on a globally competitive, high-tech footing, building on CCUS and other low carbon investments that are going to be made. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that this is a once in a century opportunity that we have to move heaven and earth to grasp. So, reflecting the importance of this topic, a very knowledgeable and experienced group of 4 speakers are joining us. They've got a wide range of backgrounds. Their CVs are on the conference papers. Each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes and we'll have about 15 minutes or so for the panel to respond to your questions after they've given us their talks. And as well as an experienced and knowledgeable speaker panel, I'm convinced we have an experienced and knowledgeable audience today. So we really do welcome your participation through questions. So I move to my first speaker, Paul Nowak, Deputy General Secretary of the TUC and in the Green Jobs Task Force. Paul.
Thanks, James, and thanks for the opportunity to say a few words on behalf of the TUC. Maybe just to say a little bit about the TUC for those people who aren't familiar with us as an organisation. We're the body that represents trade unions up and down the country, 48 unions with 5.5 million members, and those members really working in every conceivable section of the economy. All of whom actually have a stake in the issues that we're going to be talking about this morning. I mean, some of them, hundreds of thousands of them working in the energy industry, energy intensive industries, manufacturing, will have a direct stake in what decarbonisation looks like, how it will directly affect their employers and their employment, the jobs that they do. But for those who are less directly impacted, it's just still an important set of issues. It doesn't matter whether you work in a supermarket or a care home. Getting to net zero matters to us all. Tackling the existential threat of climate change matters to us all, as does doing that in a way that allows us to have a successful, sustainable economy. So I'm going to be speaking, James, with my TUC hat on, but as you also mentioned, I was a member of the government's Green Jobs Task Force, which reported earlier this year. I was also a member alongside that of the IPPR's Environmental Justice Commission, a slightly sort of broader initiative. But I think those two initiatives had things in common. First of all, they brought together not just trade unions, but also employers, education providers, government departments in the case of the Green Jobs Task Force. And I think both initiatives reported actually on the same day, on July the 14th of this year. And there was a lot of overlap in the report of both the Green Jobs Task Force and the IPPR's Commission on Environmental Justice. And maybe I'll put some links in the chat if that's useful for people to have a look at those reports if you haven't seen them. But I think what it demonstrated to me is that there is a growing consensus across industry about the action that we need to take to get to net zero, there's a growing sense of a shared ambition around some of these issues. And I think both those reports, and hopefully this will be reflected in my remarks as well, were what I would say are pragmatically ambitious. So they set out stretch for governments and stretch for employers and stretch for organisations like trade unions and our members, but they were also achievable. And I think that's important. So, I mean, I think the focus of my remarks is going to be how we secure a just transition to net zero. and the contribution that CCUS can make to that just transition. That's obviously one important economic lens, James, to look at CCUS through. I mean, there are others, and I think, you know, this will hopefully come out in the discussion as well. I mean, I see CCUS as playing an important part in the levelling up agenda. The TUC produced a report called Voice and Place a couple of years ago, where we talked about the potential for CCUS in supporting industrial clusters, whether that's in Yorkshire and the Humber, the Tees Valley, and so on. It's going to be important in terms of securing good quality employment in those sectors of the economy that we know generate good jobs and that drive high productivity. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. I think it could be important in terms of the, you know, helping to shape and contribute to the future of the UK's trading relationships post-Brexit. I mean, this is an exciting area of new technology, you know, potential for the UK in terms of becoming a net exporter of both ideas and technology. Likewise, our ability to attract inward investment into our manufacturing base. And I suppose that the final point I would make before I get into the remarks on just transition, it's also, I think, an important part of us making the transition to the right sort of balanced energy mix going forward. I mean, energy prices are very much in the headlines at the moment, and rightly so, but CCUS does potentially allow us to mitigate fossil fuels as we phase out fossil fuels, move to a future that's more focused on nuclear and renewables. But, you know, we know that, for example, gas is still going to play an important part of our balanced energy mix for some time to come. So let me just say in my remarks, James, as I say, I want to focus on just transition. And the starting point, I think, for the TUC is, how do we get to net zero? Yes. How do we meet our climate change commitment? Yes. But how do we do so in a way that works for working people, their families, and communities? How do we get there in a way that secures and also creates good quality employment, and actually avoid some of the mistakes that we saw in the past where we mishandled industrial transitions? Now, you know, the wonders of Zoom mean I'm speaking to you from my shed in Birkenhead. I mean, this is a part of the world. I grew up in Merseyside in the 80s and 90s. And we got bitter first-hand experience of how industrial transition was handled badly, and communities that took decades to recover are still recovering in some circumstances. What that meant in terms of employment, skills, people leaving the area. We can't repeat those mistakes in some of our industrial heartlands across the UK today. So that's very much the starting point for my remarks and for the TUC. So I reckon I've got 5 minutes left. I'm going to give you 5 quick thoughts, James, in those 5 minutes, what we need to do to secure that just transition. First of all, I mean, you mentioned the work that's been done by governments, working with employers, working with other parts of industry, all good stuff, but we think the government needs to be more ambitious and to raise its sights and to match its rhetoric with real investments. I mean, if you compare and contrast the level of investment going into greening the economy in the UK with the US, the Biden administration are trying to put in place a package that would equate to something like £3,000 per head of population over the course of the next decade. In the UK, we're looking at spending £180 per head over the course of the next decade. So we think there's more that the government needs to do to move us off from the sort of near the bottom of the rankings of the G7 in terms of investments in the green economy. The TUC set out a very detailed plan for the government to invest £85 billion over the course of the next couple of years in everything from new green energy infrastructure through to high-speed broadband. And for me, we need that level of ambition and that level of investment, but we need it linked with some conditionality as well. So I want to make sure that every pound of taxpayers' money that the government spends on CCUS, but on other green technology as well, is spent with one eye firmly on how we're going to use this money to secure good quality employment, how we're going to use it to make sure that we've got added value in UK supply chain. So that would be the first point. More investment needed, more ambition needed. Second point for me, really important, and it's directly linked to CCUS. We're going to see the government publish its net zero strategy maybe next week. I don't know what's in the strategy. I worry a little bit that what we'll have is a strategy that focuses a lot on giving people skills for new green jobs and says less about how we support the good quality jobs that we've got in energy and energy intensive industries in the here and now. And I think government does need to set out a plan for how it's going to support industry to retool, to reshape, to reskill, so that we've still got a strong chemicals industry, still got a strong cement industry, still got a strong automotive industry in this country. And I think CCUS could play a really important part in that, because what I don't want to see is decarbonisation on the back of deindustrialisation. I think we can still have a strong manufacturing and engineering base in this country, and CCUS can play a part in making sure that we do still have that strong manufacturing and engineering base as we go forward. Third point from me is that I think, we've seen a lot again from government about skills over the course of the last 18 months, 2 years. I think actually we need to see more to really deliver the lifelong learning that we're going to need to support this industrial transition over the course of the next decade or two. So that means things like making sure that that new skills guarantee, which I think at the moment is too prescriptive, is open to those who are trying to get level 2 qualifications, is open to those who maybe need to go on a foundation program. Crucially, is open to those who've already got level 3 qualifications, because the whole point about reskilling the workforce is that you may be taking people who are very skilled here and now for this particular job and giving them the opportunity to skill up for other opportunities coming down the line. And one of the factors in the Green Jobs Task Force report very much was encouraging government to think about creatively about how we break down the barriers to people retraining, and that does mean the financial barriers. It means putting in place things like paid time off to train, individual learning accounts, how we support people. Union learner reps play an important role in the workplace in that. Last two thoughts. One is I want just transition to be something that is done with people, not to them. And one of the key things, again, I think that runs across both the Green Jobs Task Force and the IPPR reports is this sense that you have to engage more stakeholders in this process, and crucially have to engage the workforce, and that's at every level. So we want to see employers reaching just transition agreements with their own workforces. We'd like to see sectors working together again with unions to map out what does the future of the sector look like, what does that mean in terms of skills and workforce planning, what support will we need from governments. And I think that is, we've called for what we've called the daughter of furlough scheme, but some sort of permanent short-time working scheme that would allow employers the time and the space and the support to retrain and reskill their workforces and make sure that we keep people in employment throughout those processes rather than losing them to unemployment. I'm conscious I'm dead on 10 minutes, near enough, James. So the last point is, I don't think government's got all the answers. The TUC hasn't got all the answers. The good people on this panel and indeed in the audience haven't got all the answers, but collectively, I think we can edge towards those answers. So again, one of the things that's common to the Green Jobs Task Force report and the IPPR report is this idea that we have some sort of standing commission in the UK that would bring together employers, unions, other key stakeholders to really monitor our progress towards net zero, make sure we're meeting our targets around quality employment and just transition. Crucially, as I said before, making sure that green jobs are good jobs going forward. I don't think any one of us around the table has got the answers, but I think collectively we can make a good stab at getting there. I'll leave it there, James, and happy to obviously take part in any conversation and questions and answers.
Press my mute button. Thanks, that was really terrific. And all your 5 points struck a very strong chord with me, and I'm sure it did with our audience as well. And the phrase at the end there, used green jobs have to be good jobs. I think here to that. You also mentioned earlier on the voice and place report, and you said that you might be able to provide references to these to our audience and others. That would be great if you could. So, and on the 5 points you made, if there's a document that elaborates on those, I'm sure people will be extremely interested to see that too. Thanks very much. So I think all of this is, I mean, there was a thread running through there, collaboration, very, very broad and wide collaboration over the long term. And I think that's a crucial point. Thanks. So if we move now to Richard Simon Lewis, and Richard, you were there. Richard, you were fighting valiantly against some video problems early on, and it looks as if you've got corrected. You've got control of your camera back. That's great.
I have. I'm fighting the system's demons. So apologies for that, James.
So Richard Simon Lewis is Director of Business Development, Marketing, Communications at UK Export Finance. Richard.
Thank you, James. And good morning, ladies and gentlemen. If I may, what I'd like to do is to respond to the sort of two interlinked questions posed by giving an export weighted perspective drawn from two distinct periods of my career. The first is as head of finance at the White Rose CCS project, where I worked with Lee Hackett and others for 3.5 years as part of the grant funding competition process. And clearly that didn't go in the direction that we all wanted it to, and we ended up giving evidence to the Climate Change Select Committee. And I think overall there was an enormous amount learned through that process. So that's the first perspective that I'll give on the inward investment side. And then what I'd like to do is to respond to the second part of the question through the lens of, being an ExCo member and head of business development and Marcoms at probably the most progressive ECA in the world, UK Export Finance. So two individual sort of elements and two very different perspectives. So how can the UK ensure it's seen as an attractive place for inward investment for companies seeking to develop the green products of the future? Well, look, I'm conscious that, as Paul mentioned, there are probably significant announcements from government on the horizon, and I also recognise that announcements around the first two CCS industrial clusters may also be imminent. And I'm conscious that over the last couple of days, through this fantastic conference that's been organised, it's been chock full of discussion around appropriate risk models for CCS, risk reward considerations for raising finance, the importance of CCS as a 10-point plan technology in securing highly skilled jobs in the UK and essentially revitalizing the birthplaces of the first industrial revolution. That's a direct quote from the 10-point plan. And so, to be honest, I don't have an enormous amount to add in relation to the debate that's taken place, but when I sort of reflect on where we can go for lessons learned in relation to inward investment, then probably the best place that we can sort of land is drawing valuable insights from offshore wind in terms of the frameworks that were established, the precedent that was established from a financing context, which I think is going to be incredibly important if we are going to accelerate the pathway for CCS. Now, when I joined White Rose, I'd acted as financial advisor to the consortium. I used to head up the renewable energy group at Lloyds Bank. And when I joined White Rose as head of finance, one thing that struck me was that, we had to apply the lessons that we'd learned from the billions of funding raised through project finance for offshore wind. And clearly CCS at that time was a first of a kind project. There was very little sort of financing precedent. So we had 2 billion sterling to raise. The offshore wind part of the market had put down deep roots. I mean, clearly the first deals, the likes of Boreas that I was involved in, were not easy deals. I mean, the structures that we're seeing in the market now in places like Asia are frankly almost cookie cutter. They're almost take it or leave it structures. But in the early days of offshore wind, the structures were highly tailored. There were issues with the projects, with the early projects in terms of foundations, and the banks had to get comfortable with this new sector. So the financing structures were conservative, sensible. The business model that the government put in place was designed to attract inward investment, and that's what we saw. But clearly there were things along the way that we've learned that we frankly need to apply towards carbon capture and storage so that it can put down deep and meaningful roots in the UK. So when we were raising finance for White Rose, one of the things that struck me were that the first institutions to come alongside our finance raising, our capital formation, were actually the European export credit agencies, the sister ECAs to UK Export Finance. And that wasn't because they had some sort of incredibly strong or unusual risk appetite for a first of a kind project, but it's because they wanted to support their supply chains and the companies involved. In this particular case, there was procurement coming from Alstom, Tom and Linda within our consortium, and the European ECAs were coming behind that procurement. But fundamentally, what those export credit agencies understood was that, you know, government would have to put in place an appropriate business model and an appropriate level of risk reward for the commercial banks to come alongside White Rose or the Shell project, if Shell was using project finance. And therefore, you know, the benefit of their sovereign guarantees would flow. And I think fundamentally what those ECAs understood was that they, you know, they wanted to be alongside CCS at the very early stage, because frankly, they recognized that if they left that technology mature before they then supported the supply chains and the procurement, then frankly, the opportunity would be lost for their supply chains. So essentially, the lesson from seeing those export credit agencies come alongside our process, and we had 22 banks involved in White Rose when we were moving the financing along, was that it's absolutely key that, you know, these technologies, CCS is supported as it grows, and hence we secure valuable market share in overseas markets for CCS once we put down deep and meaningful supply chain roots in the UK. And so, you know, the importance of precedent, i.e. the importance of doing the first deals, is a key takeaway for attracting inward investment. And the second profound message is that you can't wait for these technologies to be mature before you then support the supply chains. You have to do both concurrently. You have to be alongside the supply chains as the technology matures, so that ultimately you're learning and the supply chains are prospering. That's something that I think is a huge learning from offshore wind, and frankly from the White Rose experience. Now, turning to the second part of the question posed, what are the export opportunities for CCUS, and how can we maximize these opportunities, ensuring manufacturing skills and jobs remain in the UK? Well, you know, on the basis that, you know, the audience has been listening to debates around CCS, then I'm not going to go into the sort of technical aspects of why CCS is going to drive manufacturing and jobs, because I think Paul articulated the benefits of the technology. But what I'm very keen to do is to sort of reflect on the embedded ambition in the 10-point plan around, and this is a direct quote, the 10-point plan talks about it's the embedded ambition in forging great new industries that export to new markets around the world. And when you look at CCS and you look at the analysis that's been done on CCS in terms of the value add of bringing CCS into the UK, the rump of value of CCS comes from the realization of export potential. So it's one thing, you know, getting the clusters in place, but frankly, if you really want to drive enormous value for the UK from CCS, it's how you then transplant that knowledge and the skills from the supply chain overseas into new markets. And I think that's a role that clearly there's an important part for policy, for sister departments in government. You know, we work very closely with BEIS and colleagues in DIT in relation to moving these 10-point plan technologies forward. But fundamentally, I think, you know, an export credit agency, I firmly believe, has an enormously important role to play in realizing that export technology. So maybe just a couple of comments and thoughts on UKEF, because I'm conscious that for some of you in the audience, you may not have come across an ECA before. It may be unfamiliar to you. So just to say that, you know, we help companies of all sizes across all sectors by helping them win business, perform contracts and get paid through a variety of government guarantees, the sovereign guarantees, lending and insurance. And we basically actively bridge the finance gap. And I think for CCS, we can potentially act to crowd in private capital, you know, which is clearly key for developing critical infrastructure like CCS. We're a government department. We operate with the consent of Treasury, meaning our guarantee is a sovereign guarantee. We offer support, not subsidies, and we operate at no net cost to the taxpayer. In fact, we return a profit to Treasury every year. So we are a very innovative and flexible ECA, and I think, you know, what I'm very keen to do on this call today is to make clear our desire to reach out to the clusters when those announcements are made, so that we can build a sort of bridge with the cluster projects, so we can, you know, make the underlying supply chains aware of our offer. We can work with those clusters to realize that export potential, because fundamentally content is king for an export credit agency. If you look at what we've done in offshore wind,
Richard,
where we
forgive me for
am I running out of time?
Other folks' time.
Right. Okay. So I'm done. So
I mean, it's very interesting. There's no question. That's why I was hesitant to intervene.
The last point is, for any clusters that are announced, please reach out to us. We'd love to talk to you. That's it.
Great.
Apologies.
No apology needed, Richard. That's terrific. And there are threads that connect what you've been saying with what Paul was saying as well. You both talked about inward investment, the importance of jobs. Early action, I think the background to that is how competitive things are going to be, and therefore getting our own supply chain stimulated early is going to be crucially important, and not forgetting, of course, the huge export opportunities that there are for us. So, Richard, thank you very much indeed for that. Louise.
Thank you, James, and good morning, everybody. It's good to see so many of you on the call today. And Richard, as someone that hopes to be successful in those forthcoming announcements, consider yourself reached out to a particular cluster that I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about in the next 10 minutes or so, max. So my name is Louise Kingham. I have recently joined BP back in May. You can read a bit more about the backstory, but essentially I've been invited to this panel, for which I'm very grateful, to talk to you from a company perspective about how CCUS and our plans around it can support the just transition and levelling up. So I'm going to say some things which are terribly complementary to the things that Paul has already said. I've learned a lot in listening to Richard in the last few minutes, and I suspect some of the things I'd like to see result will connect with what Jonathan might say in following around sort of supply chains. So there's three key points that I'd like to talk to you about in the next few minutes. I think the first of those is crucially that CCUS can support a just transition. Like Paul, I was involved in the IPPR Commission earlier in the year, and also BP contributed to the Green Jobs Task Force. So in a very similar place, very aligned, and I'll make a few comments related to that in a few moments. But it absolutely is correct that we can protect existing jobs as well as create some good quality new ones along the way, which will inevitably support and improve sort of community investment and ideally, from our point of view, regeneration too. At the heart of how we do this successfully is partnership. We've talked about shared ambition and collaboration, but the scale and the pace at which we've got to go means that partnership is absolutely crucial to getting this done. And we have a long track record of working in partnership in this sector. We know how to do it well. And I'll give you a little bit of a flavour about the Northern Endurance Partnership to reflect exactly how we're trying to put that together and have been working in a very practical way to create those partnerships. And I think the third point that I would like to amplify with you is that CCUS actually also offers a model for creating not just value for people in place and community and at society level, but also for shareholder value, which is really important for business it's a must. We have to create sustainable businesses as we go through this transition. It's incredibly important that we get that right for all sorts of obvious reasons for those of you that are in business. But we think that it can be done. We think we can create that long-term shareholder value and bring the benefits that flow from that through. So let me give you a little bit more detail on each of those three key messages that I just want to share with you. I think James touched on the scale at the beginning, actually, when we talked about, 30% of global emissions comes from heavy industry. And so decarbonising that is essential. We cannot get this job done if we don't tackle that first and foremost as we go on the journey. We're not expecting these industries to disappear. That would be unjust and unfair. So what we need to do is prioritise those in order to get them decarbonised as effectively as we can. And that will affect millions of people worldwide, actually, highly skilled in good quality jobs, which sit at the heart of local communities. So CCUS offers us with a model that not only can protect the jobs, as I said at the beginning, but also add new good quality ones. It's a technology which is an enabler, both for levelling up as well as a just transition, as Paul said at the beginning, and we completely agree with that. And we're doing some work internally on our own workforce planning and then connecting with community organisations that need to have their voices better understood by big organisations like ours, so that we do it in the right way and we reach the hard to reach people in communities that deserve to have good quality jobs and access to and fair access to all of these opportunities we can create. So Net Zero Teesside is the example, the project example that you probably won't be surprised I'm going to touch on. You would have heard yesterday, I think, about Net Zero Teesside and the Zero Carbon Humber clusters as coming together to create the East Coast cluster. And we can see that there are huge benefits for communities across the north of England if we can be successful and get off the blocks as quickly as possible to make this project a reality at scale. We know that we've seen this part of the country see industries depart, and as I've said, that would be unjust to see any more of that. And there's opportunities to do things very differently. And as Paul said, to not repeat some of the mistakes of the past, but learn from those in getting this right. The East Coast Cluster, I think, can play a central role in helping us to do that and bring local economy benefit. And at its peak, I think that's probably going to be around about 25,000 jobs between, say, 2023 for up to 2050. So huge opportunity for both existing good quality jobs as well as the new ones that will come through developing industrial carbon capture, the low carbon hydrogen production, which is part of Net Zero Teesside, negative emissions power, which is also within that cluster, alongside with some of the other jobs that exist within the high emitting businesses that want to be part of the Northern Endurance Partnership, where we can take that carbon and store it out in the North Sea. So let me touch a bit about partnerships and describe a little bit around the partnerships that are in play in the Northern Endurance Partnership, because you absolutely could not do this if we didn't have quite a complex and large set of partnerships. But as I've mentioned at the beginning, the oil and gas industry particularly knows how to do this and has done joint venturing for over a century. So this is not unusual for us. It's possibly unusual for some of the audiences and stakeholders around these projects to understand. But in terms of how we do it in practice, this is not difficult. This is collaborations that we understand. And I think when you learn the lessons of the pandemic, and we saw how truly global partnerships working at scale can deliver against the odds transformative outcomes, we know that this approach is doable and can be applied to addressing decarbonisation, and particularly industrial decarbonisation. So we've got a situation, I think, today in terms of the audience that's here with us now, where we're not arguing about who takes what position, we're not arguing about which technology. We're clear that this is all about and. Other speakers have mentioned the role for decarbonising gas particularly, and how that works alongside renewables and other technologies. So we're well past that now, I think, and we appreciate that we have a common goal to bring people together to make this work. So we're working, for example, with Equinor and Total on the development of the power station with carbon capture, Net Zero Teesside Power. We're working also with those partners, plus National Grid and Shell, who are part of the Northern Endurance Partnership, which is the storage and transportation network that connects all of the large emitters, including the power station and the potential hydrogen plants, through to that CCUS facility. We've got a vision for working with local community organisations as part of the project. So we've listened really hard to the voices in the community at the local level. And I think for us, actually, the biggest challenge is connecting those voices and what they're telling us about how to do this and get this right with these big at-scale programs and projects. And so that bit in the middle is the tricky bit, where we've got to work smartly, particularly around our recruitment strategies, making the best of the capabilities across the partnership. So where BP isn't the smartest partner at something, we look to another member of the group who is, and pull that capability in, so that the sum of the parts is really adding some value when we collaborate. So we've also worked, for example, with the Tees Valley Combined Authority. We've been listening to local community groups. We've been understanding what the skills challenges are and what the opportunities are to support that, so that we can create this kind of ecosystem in a particular geography that delivers real community value, and also people and nature benefits too, ultimately. So in terms of the model for creating long-term shareholder value, this is really important, where, and I think people in this audience will understand that when you're in business, this is part of the job you have to do. And whilst there are calls for maybe some of the industries that get challenged to say, we'd actually rather just you weren't around tomorrow, that's not realistic. It's not fair, it's not just. So decarbonising industrial sectors particularly puts that job to do at the top of the list, I think, for many of us. And we need to, whilst we can appreciate that the call to action, it's been an incredibly powerful force, all of those groups and community organisations who have told us we need to do more, go faster, pick up the pace, are absolutely spot on. But we also have to do that recognising that there are high carbon industries today that need to be low carbon industries within the next decade. And that's what the job of CCUS can really deliver for us all. And it will in turn create that shareholder value that is important, as well as the value for members of society, as we each are. So whilst the call to action is really, really helpful in raising this as an issue in the minds of us all as members of society, we've got to make that transition together. And that's where I think the value of CCS really can play as we go on this journey. Thank you, James.
Louise, thank you very much indeed for that. And what's fascinating is the theme of collaboration, and so many people have to work together. You've raised it, Richard raised it, Paul raised it as well. So I think we're all conscious of how many organizations and people have to be engaged in making this work. And your point about shareholder value, I think you're right to raise it. And I think it chimes with something that Richard said on business models, because I think we've all said, people say, where's the capital coming from? And government's only got so much money, but I think people feel that if we can get the business models right, then there's a huge amount of private capital ready and willing and eager to get this done. And of course, the other thing for you is this is real time, isn't it? A very, very major project in a major cluster. And I was saying to myself, I can't wish you good luck, because what about the other clusters? But the best thing I can do is wish you all good luck. And hoping for good news in the next few weeks, because I think we all know all the clusters around the UK have to succeed, and succeed quickly, if we're going to meet our targets on net zero. Louise, thank you very much indeed. And now, Jonathan, over to you. You on mute, Jonathan?
There we go. Thank you very much. And I feel my thunder's been stolen on a couple of these points, because I'm very much aligned.
Occupational hazard of being last.
Yeah. That's all right. That's all right. But I think what's good about that is that, we've spoken a lot about collaboration. We've spoken a lot about being aligned. And actually, this is key, because we need to align around some of the ways of doing things for it to be, for it to go ahead as it has to. So just a moment before I get into what I'm going to say, my name's Jonathan Minnitt. I have a background as a process engineer, and I started my career on a carbon capture plant, and I had endless trouble keeping the thing going, and it was one of the most problematic plants in a very complex system, refining system and so on. I'm sure you're all familiar with, but it was a great grounding. And there's things, as I'm coming to these conversations now with the amine systems and so on, that remind me of that. And what kind of inspires me through that is, I worked at Sasol out in South Africa, and that plant was incredibly complex, and that plant came about out of necessity. It's oil and diesel from coal, and although it was a different era, it came out of necessity, and we face the same sort of challenge now with this transition. And it's great because we've got the right tools, I think, to do it. So I will touch on a couple of different angles here. I've been asked to look at the wind perspective as well. So I will just share in terms of what we're looking at from an Aker Solutions perspective in a transition from oil and gas to wind, and just highlight some of the key things there, where that's going really well from an integrating the supply chain into that change. So I guess the first thing to recognize around the wind perspective and the transition through wind is that I think that wind from a lower hanging fruit perspective has come. We've got the onshore, and the shallower offshore is being developed well and strong, and that's really matured. And I think in some ways the oil and gas industry, and has missed that opportunity that was there a few years back because it was a little bit under the radar. But in terms of where it's moving, in terms of the higher complexity, deeper water offshore wind, I think is a real good understanding of how we can transition and the value actually of bringing the oil and gas industry through that just transition. Okay, so 80% of the world's best offshore wind is in deeper water. And what that means is, you need different structures. You're probably better off with bigger turbines, and bigger turbines need bigger floating foundations. And that's something, that we as an oil and gas industry and as Aker Solutions specifically have a real maturity in bringing to the market. We've been able to bring costs down on those and shift it into multiple industries and demand those foundations, driving safety into the way we operate them too. And that's something that I think we've got to make sure we maintain the sight of, is driving safety continually into the way that we're doing this. So just to then look at how we do that, and this will bring me on to the next bit. So in terms of those structures, whether they be concrete or steel, a key element around getting that to market and making it competitive is the way we manufacture those, and is the way that we standardize those designs. And that, to me, is a key part of this. And if we look at the whole supply chain, we're not going to be able to do everything out of the UK. We don't want to, we want to make sure, that we do capture industrial elements of it, but we won't be doing possibly some of the bigger vessels in terms of manufacture outside of the UK. But the big question around that is, we might not be able to do everything locally, but there's a good chunk of scope that we can do locally. And I think we need to be ambitious about how we try and look at that and which bits we try and capture. So a good example, just around something that went not as well as it might have from the wind industry historically, is the turbine blades. You know, that market has shifted almost to you know, to Denmark, and I know there are pockets of that excellence in the UK, so I don't want to downplay that at all, but the vast majority of that value has been grabbed by Denmark, and they saw that and they ran for it, and they've been doing that for quite some time. And the opportunity that we have here is to say, okay, we see this opportunity with CCUS and the wider CO2 economy, and I absolutely believe in that. So what can we grab, and what can we as a holistic sort of industry look to develop jointly? And you know, we spoke about how do you take the supply chain with, and to me that's an incredibly important part. And Richard, you know, you mentioned that yourself. It's not just a case of the supply chain will follow at the end and be able to deliver. It has to be a joint journey. And there are a couple of ways to do that, and I'll come on to that momentarily. But I was just wanting to share something that I saw on a LinkedIn post over the last few days, and it was a map of cycle paths, and the comment across Europe, and the comment was, why do so many people in Holland cycle? And you can just see from the heat map of the infrastructure development around cycle paths that Holland is just such a hotspot. It's bright red. The infrastructure is there, and that's great. So we're going through the clusters. We're developing this in a really strategic and positive way as the UK, and that is the foundation. But what if the cycleways have been developed, but nobody invested in bike factories or bike training or helmets or cycle gear? It wouldn't be worthwhile. And I think let's best leave the number of bicycles ditched in the canals off the topic for another table. We'll stop the analogy there. But the point I'm making, you see, is yes, we need the foundation, but we also need to make sure that all of the bits that go into making that a success in the longer run are there. And then just to pick up on that point, so how do we do that? We've spoken a little bit about collaboration and integrating complex systems, working across complex systems, many stakeholders, even in the value chain, and a huge number of supply chain companies, even at the next level and the two levels below that, incredible number of people that need to be aligned with that. One of the ways that we've seen particularly successfully deliver value, and I think this is one thing we need to make sure, is we focus on long-term value, not on cost on everything. Because if we focus on simply the cost at every cut and turn, it will drive us away from what we have already. But if we focus on the value and moving towards that, that integrated goal for success, then we'll find it. And I believe the supply chain will be more competitive on that journey. An example of that. So we work with Aker BP very closely out in Norway. We have a number of alliances with them, and they're focused alliances on delivering tiebacks, on delivering platforms and so on. And we've seen incredible cost savings through project delivery because the risk is properly managed, it is shared, it's properly understood, and it is allocated in the right way. Primarily, it brings everybody together around the single goal of making the project a success. And that's really what we have to do in the UK in terms of driving for the delivery of carbon capture and storage, of driving for a just transition. So one of the things that we have to do is focus on generating that vision and the joint delivery of projects as a single focus. I see you on my screen. Does that mean my time is up? James.
Jonathan, we've got about 10 minutes left, and we've got some questions. If there's something you really are burning still to say, do.
No, that's okay. I think the last thing I'd just like to say is let's focus on the things that we know we can do well, be ambitious about what we can do in the UK. We know we're really good at digital. We know we're really good at engineering and smart manufacturing. How can we leverage those from the supply chain perspective and plug in early to where the system's going?
Okay.
Thanks,
Jonathan, thank you very much. And again, repeating themes. Although you brought in the theme of safety, which I'm sure all the other panelists will echo, and something we must never forget. And the large-scale process industry, I know, has been deeply engaged in making their activities safe because of the necessity of doing so over many, many years. And I think have discovered and proven that a safe operation is also an efficient and productive operation as well. They go hand in hand. But your emphasis you're giving it to supply chains and the complex systems that it involves, and the enormous tasks, but the enormous benefits that flow from getting that right, I think are those points are well made. And we haven't really, we could have a whole conference on supply chains. The CCSA did some work on supply chains that was published that I commend to people. Yeah. And the CCUS Council, a group of that, is going to be working on supply chains so that we can unlock all of the benefits that we've been talking about today. And I'm delighted to note that Dame Judith Hackett, who was involved in the opening of this conference, is going to be leading that supply chain group. And I can't think of anyone better to do it than Dame Judith. We have a few minutes left only, and I'm going to have to apologize because we've got some questions and I don't think we're going to get them all covered. Yeah, in fairness, I'm trying to look for ones that I'm trying to give priority sequence, but also things that I know are sort of within the experience and knowledge of the panelists. Maybe one from Chris Kent. What role does industry have to remind government that there may be some parts of the supply chain where the UK may struggle to be competitive? He said, i.e. rather than e.g. large fabrication. Where is the balance between focused supply chain support and wider levelling up support? Any of the panelists like to comment on that?
I'm quite happy to share something on that. I think there's a lot of examples where some of that manufacturing, we've seen Aker style manufacturing setups for some substructures, for example, where it's fabricated in a larger yard, and because of the way it's designed, it can be fabricated in more places, so it allows the local supply chain to be competitive. And that's the sort of thing I'm thinking of. It requires collaboration, so it's not necessarily that the most colossal thing is built in one place. I think we have to change, and this is going to require conscious change to the way we do things. So I think we need to really consciously look at, can we build this thing differently? Yes, there's some stuff we can bring from oil and gas, from other major industry, but what are the new thinking elements that we can do? Build it in a smaller place and then assemble on site. For example, that might not fit everywhere, but it's an example.
Okay, thanks for that, Jonathan. Anyone else like to comment on that question?
Yeah, maybe one contribution from my side. So I think in relation to the question that's been posed, there is an energy supply chain task force that's been set up, hosted by two of our ministers, and it involves, cross Whitehall sort of contributions from BEIS, UK Export Finance, DIT, but most importantly, the key stakeholders involved in the industry. So we have all the major trade associations involved in that, and all the major stakeholders involved in these 10pp technologies, including CCS. And actually, the issue that Chris touches on there, are one of the things that is being discussed within that forum. And as I've said, it's led by 2 ministers. It's got all the departments vested in moving these technologies along, involved in the discussion, and it sits on a regular basis. So I think those things are being discussed, and I believe the CCSA has a seat at the table. So Olivia and her colleagues are involved in those discussions.
Okay, thanks for that, Richard. If the other panelists don't mind, there's another question I'd like to raise on a rather different topic. It's from Vicky Copeman. Could I please pick up please on comments by Paul and Louise raised around listening hard to local communities? And Vicky, be keen to hear from panelists. What are the must-dos to ensure that we not only hear, but really listen to local people? And as it said, it's with them and not to them. I think you said that, Paul, earlier on. So anyone like to comment on that?
Yeah, happy to, James. I mean, I think one of the things I'm really keen on is this idea, and it was a feature of the Green Jobs Task Force, that companies are asked to produce just transition plans and to develop those in partnership with local stakeholders, including their own workforces, but the local community as well. I think that's important in terms of transparency, giving people a stake in the future. And maybe just to pick up, because I know we're short of time, very briefly, because I think it does link into some of Jonathan's learning points from the offshore wind industry, as well as some of the missed opportunities in terms of whether it's, the production of blades or turbines or whatever. I mean, there's been quite a bit of contention about the value of some of the jobs in offshore wind, and it's a mixed picture, but not all of those jobs are good jobs. And one of the voices that is absent in large parts of offshore wind, unlike oil and gas, unlike many of our energy intensive industries, is independent trade unions around the table. And so I would say, a challenge for those involved in CCUS to think about how you actively engage unions and encourage participation. I think the more that we can do that upfront and in a proactive way, rather than, in offshore wind, I've got no doubt at all at the end of the day, our unions will end up around the table with the key employers. I've seen it over the last 3 or 4 years in employers as varied as Ryanair, Uber, Hermes, organisations that started off with no union relationships and have now reached agreements with our unions. I'd rather than us getting there in 5-10 years time, I'd like that to be right up front at the start of the process, if it's all possible.
Okay, many thanks for that, Paul.
Yeah, and can I just add to that very briefly, James, because in addition to what Paul is saying, what we've been doing, Vicky, for the Northern Endurance Partnership, the East Coast Cluster project, is talking to local community groups, volunteer groups, networks, so local charity groups, because part of this levelling up is about some serious regeneration and lifting people out of deprivation, and so these people will be hard to reach. As for us as a large employer or a cluster, they're probably not the people that would most obviously come to us looking for job opportunities. So we need to get, part of that listening is for us to learn and understand how we're much more effective at making sure the value from this, which is the levelling up and the just transition, is far more than just buzzwords or phrases, but actually it changes people's lives. That's what we need to do. And so the challenge, as it was put to me this morning when I was chairing a North East Forum for Business in the Community, is one of the places I listened to this conversation, was how do we support Dan, who's a single dad of 3 kids, who's living in really shabby accommodation in a rough part of town and doesn't think he's got any job opportunity coming his way? How do we get to him?
Louise, thanks very much for that. And I was thinking earlier about a just transition and the stories of Birkenhead in the past. I think we're talking about something very fundamental, and it's a significantly unfinished piece of the business of capitalism, to recognize that communities matter and people matter as we generate wealth. Just looking at the clock, I'm afraid that there's some other very good questions, and my apologies to those who raised them that we don't have time to get to them, but maybe some of the panel can look at these questions and follow up with people in due course. So I think our session's concluding. Our thanks to our excellent panel, and thanks to our excellent audience as well, which I can see based on their questions, a very broad variety of questions. I think we should all be really invigorated by the tremendous opportunity that CCUS and beating climate change generally gives us, and the opportunity to strengthen considerably our industrial base to the benefit of individuals, to companies, to regions, and to the nation. can I just make one other point? We haven't talked about diversity and inclusion in this subject. We could have done, and I know it's something very strong in the minds of all the panelists and others. And I'd like to think, as well as with safety, that diversity and inclusion should be really important and integral to everything we do in achieving net zero. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I commend to you the next sessions in our conference at 10:45. BP have a sponsored session on the implementation of UK hydrogen strategy. At 12 noon. There's a session hosted by the CCUS's European colleagues on Europe's path to 2030 for CCUS. Again, thank you all very much.